Are you an optimist or a pessimist? Do you see things with a silver lining, or do you see them always as grey clouds? These distinctions of being an optimist or a pessimist are ones we use all the time. And actually, they're kind of useless, because both of the things we're describing, being an optimist or being a pessimist, are pretty unwise. Optimism, the way we usually talk about it, means believing things will be good even when all of the evidence is to the contrary. And pessimism is the reverse, believing things will be bad even when all the evidence is to the contrary. Neither seems like a very sensible perspective for us to undertake. Nor, I would say, is either very much a religious perspective. This week's parashah, Shalach Lecha, focuses extensively on a beautiful, complicated, tragic literary unit in chapters 13 and 14 of the Book of Numbers, where 12 spies are sent by Moses into the land of Israel to go scout it and to report back. The spies represent each of the 12 tribes. Probably young, distinguished men from each of the 12 tribes are sent on a journey from the desert, where the people are camped, into the land of Israel. That means crossing over desert and mountains and hills, passing by the sea where the dangerous Philistines live, crossing beneath the Amalekite territories where they already are afraid, and ultimately reaching over the mountains to see that the people that live behind them are giants. Terrifying giants from a different time in history. These 12 spies that go into the land spend 40 days surveying the land. They are pretty close to the land itself when they leave. The people are camped at Kadesh Barnea, somewhere which is in the northern Sinai Peninsula, actually probably in what is today the state of Israel, not too far from Beersheba. And they undertake the journey of going from there north into what's today the West Bank, and coming ultimately to the city of Hebron. There they come full circle from 500 years earlier, when their distant ancestor Abraham bought the first bit of land that we have a link to in that land of Israel. He bought a cave, of course, in a field to bury Sarah. And here, all these years later, there's 12 young men who find themselves encountering giants in a land flowing with milk and honey. And they take back with them a giant cluster of grapes, so big that it required 2 people to carry it on a frame. And they return, ultimately, to Moses to give a report. Now, this is the beginning of the 40-year period of wandering that we know of. They're probably only a few weeks into that journey out of Egypt. The memory of Egypt and of the plagues is still quite fresh. And they're positioned to go ahead and invade right where they are. That's the plan. But when the spies come back to report to Moses, they say, actually, the land is pretty scary. There's all different people who live there, the Phoenicians by the coast, the Amalekites in the desert, other tribes that live in the hill country, and ultimately, most threateningly, there's a bunch of giants, some of whom are named. 10 of the 12 spies say, we can't do it. 2 say, we can. And what we see first is a private deliberation among these 12 spies and Moses, where they're basically in a war council considering it. But something dramatic changes in verse 32 of chapter 13, when suddenly the 10 spies who say that they can't go, that it's too intimidating, that it's too difficult, they take their case beyond the war council. They go and speak to the people publicly, and they tell them, there's no way we can do this. We'll all be cut down as soon as we enter the land. And the people panic. The panic is extreme, and we can see that by the cantillation of the Torah, by the language of the Torah. The people absolutely lose it. After going through the trauma of leaving Egypt and traveling across the desert, even though it's only been maybe a few weeks or a few months, they can't stomach the idea that they're not able to enter, not able to conquer the giants and the peoples who they find on the other side of those hills. Instead, they turn on Moses and Aaron, and the other 2 spies, who are named Caleb, Joshua, characters we'll get to know more. They turn on them and they start to stone them. They have the stones in their hand ready to kill these leaders who have led them this far, and the two spies in particular who have suggested that they can conquer the land, when suddenly God appears on the scene. God appears and is angry. Angry that the people have panicked, angry that the spies have stoked fear amongst the people, angry that they're not willing to believe that they can do it, and ultimately God's desire is to kill them all off. Moses only talks God down by appealing to God's reputation, saying in a very casual and relatable way, well, what are people going to think of you? What are people going to say if they hear that the God that took all these people out of Egypt just took them into the desert and killed them all there? God relents, sort of. God agrees not to kill them all, but the death sentence is simply commuted for life in the wilderness. Because the result is God tells Moses that the people are going to have to wander, going to have to camp, going to have to live in that wilderness where they are at this moment for another 40 years, so that the entire generation who rejected the opportunity to invade dies out. At one point in their panic, the people had said, "Woe on us, if only we just died in this wilderness." And God turns their words against them like an angry parent, saying, fine, you want to die in the wilderness? You'll die in the wilderness. Your carcasses will drop right here, and your children will be the ones to go in, but not you. It's a really powerful story, and it's one of our original myths. It's one of the things that actually is so critical as a pivot between the different books of the Torah. Because it's this moment where the trust really breaks down between the people and Moses, and between Moses and God. Everyone is simply making an appeal to self-interest at this point, and everyone seems to have lost that thing which we might call hope. Now, are the people being optimistic or pessimistic? Are the spies being foolish or practical? Because they're not wrong, they didn't lie. There are lots of people living there. Some of them are giants. The land is difficult to traverse, and they're pretty poorly equipped. As the defecting spies say, we look like grasshoppers compared to the people that are there. There's no way we can do this. Is that pessimism or pragmatism? And meanwhile, for Caleb and Joshua, who say, yeah, we can do it, are they being optimistic? Are they just simply seeing the best possible outcome? Or are they being foolish? Are they endangering the people's safety by telling them they can do something they can't? It's a really interesting moment to consider what this outlook of optimism or pessimism means. I think ultimately it shows us that both of those ideas are pretty useless. What might be more useful is an idea which we as Jews actually are pretty poor at talking about, which is this notion of hope. Hope isn't optimism. And actually, I've been quite inspired by reading a really excellent book by Terry Eagleton called Hope Without Optimism. In that book, Eagleton suggests that actually what it means to be hopeful is totally categorically different than what it means to be optimistic. Because optimism, as we've said, means that you believe things are going to be turning out for the best, even when the evidence is to the contrary. Optimism means seeing those giants and going, oh, well, it'll be fine. But is that what Joshua and Caleb really do? I don't think it is. And I think that's the point of this whole story, is that ultimately it's not about whether or not the people are capable of the invasion, whether or not they're able to conquer these other peoples and the difficult land and the giants they find there. Because the dissenters, the ones who say they can't, they're right. By all accounts, they have no ability to militarily overtake the people that they find there. It would be foolish to rush in and to try and do so, seeing what they've seen. But that's only if we consider the purely military implications. What's missing from the equation of those dissenters is the spiritual dimension. And that's what God's angry about. God's not angry because they lied, because they didn't lie. They told the truth. But they forgot about hope. They forgot about the acknowledgement that there's something more than simply the reality they saw around them. Because they forgot about God. They forgot about the fact that God had promised them, by making a covenant with them, that God would come to their assistance. God would be their ally. And in forgetting that, they lose sight of arguably the most important part of this whole moment, which is not can we or can't we conquer these people, But do we have God on our side? Do we have reason to hope? The lack of hope in the story is what makes this story a tragedy. And I mean tragedy in the genuine classical sense of tragedy. Moses is here a tragic hero. We root for him, but we root for him even as we see him fail. And the story is ultimately a tragic one. And that's important, because hope is intimately connected to tragedy. In Terry Eagleton's book, he writes at one point, tragedy is concerned with what, if anything, survives when humanity has been hacked down to almost nothing. Whatever residue then remains, whatever still refuses to give way, is what can assuredly be built upon. It is thus that nothing veers on its axis to become something. It's quite powerful language, actually, because what he's describing is something which we talk about often in casual ways, but we fail to really internalize in serious ways, which is that it's tragedy and trauma and difficulty which allow us to have hope, because hope is more than just crossing your fingers and thinking everything will be all right. Hope is actually looking at the worst possible outcome, looking at the situation as it really is, being realistic and pragmatic and practical, and still recognizing that something persists. Something refuses to give way. There is something yet to be built upon. And that's what the spies fail to do. It's Joshua and Caleb who look at it and go, yes, it's bad. The people are scary. The giants are huge. We have a very low likelihood of success on purely militaristic terms. But there's still something for us to build on and rely on, because we have a covenant which we have in our hands and which assures us of promises. I think the story of the spies is about hope and about the failure of people to have hope. But even the word is something which we often think of differently. We think of it as a foolish nearsightedness, as not thinking about the practical or pragmatic implications. But hope really, if done right, is quite different from that. That's optimism. Hope is something else. And I think that as a religion, as spiritual people, hope is one of the most important things that we can hang on to. In any time, but especially in difficult times. Because it's precisely those difficult times that allow us to be able to see that there is more, that there is still something remaining, that there's still something which we can build upon and grow into a future which is not foolish, not optimistic, but practical. If we do it right, whether we're spying a land that we're meant to be invading, or simply going about our day-to-day lives and the difficulties we face, hope is ultimately the most practical thing we can do.